So today we're going to talk about prioritization, and we're going to talk about estimation, and then what those result in the sprint process. So like we were talking about yesterday, so why do we even need to prioritize those things we can start off with? And then also sort of like a level setting of where we are in the process, because there's a sort of roadmap view and the product view of like what are the items we want to cover strategically, which is a little bit different than what we're going to do today. So today it's kind of that, sprint to sprint, week to week basis on what we need to do next and the priority on that. And so there is some tie to that overall strategy as well. And so in a future week, we can look at companies that have even backlogs where they ask for features to be ranked out there. Jira has one. Twitter kind of casually, or X casually covers it in their requests. And then the more people request it, the more it may be bumped up there. But today we're thinking more of the day-to-day. But to your point, why do we even prioritize something to do in the backlog?
Step one is creating these list of stories, these things to do. Once those are created, it's important to think about them in terms of what is most important from an MVP perspective. That's one way to think about it. What can I implement one at a time to get the most useful thing, usable thing out in the world, that we can learn from it, that we can test it. Sometimes for folks that will involve delight features, minimum desirable product, but it's really making sure that the right things go out in the right order, regardless of if they are easier or more difficult than something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point is for the MVP and for the customer, how are we ranking these on, that value compared to the effort it takes and the impact it can have for that customer, knowing that we only have, limited resources. Maybe we only have one developer or one front-end developer and one back-end developer. So there's another framework that I just saw today on Twitter, and maybe you know this one. I guess I missed this one, but have you ever heard of the Gherkin method for user stories?
Not by name.
The pickles?
No.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the little pickles, it's a great charcuterie board addition. Absolutely, in addition to the salamis and cheese boards, or if you're budget college student, the butter boards, I guess is what they do on the TikTok. But Gherkin's user stories are scenario, the behavior, given the beginning state of the scenario. So given that I'm on an iPhone 14, when, then, which is a testable outcome, and so it's got this whole, Gherkin. Doesn't really spell Gherkin. I'll have to figure out. I like these frameworks because it keeps us grounded on this framework for users and delivery value, because there is this tendency, and you'll see it so many places, where they just kind of get sloppy with the user stories, and then they're not connected to the user, and they're not delivery value, and it makes it kind of more likely to not be as successful for that outcome later. But you'll see it. So your goal as a product manager is to shift them towards that, dealing with the processes, people, and companies that you have. So like anything, we've got to advocate for the best process and kind of accept a little bit of where we are, make our progress that way. Through those Agile rituals we were talking about before, the backlog grooming and sprint planning, that's normally when this happens. And there's a whole bunch of different ways you can prioritize them. I noticed 38 different frameworks when I was researching this, so I'm not going to cover 38. There's a few that you'll hear quite a bit there, like the Moscow method, the must, shoulds, coulds, or won'ts. A lot of times we kind of reframe that won'ts to maybe future. Sometimes the future means the trash can next to you. But it's not just kind of a good client-facing terminology to use as won't do sometimes, but sometimes that's a bold conversation. You want to make sure that there's a reason why you're not doing those things, and if there is another case to be made, we can bring it up there. So is that one of the methods used, or do you have a more preferred one? And there's quite a few fun ways to do that as well.
I think about things like the Moscow method, the earlier stage. What types of things are we going to include? What things are we not going to include? Not necessarily on a weekly basis, but thinking at it maybe more at an epic level, or when you're putting together a roadmap. For me, in the day-to-day, most of the places, in fact, all of the development agencies that I've worked with or in-house have used some sort of a pointing method, whether it's t-shirt sizing or Fibonacci. It's a good way to get a sense of difficulty. I know you're familiar with velocity and, really understanding, getting kind of like a sniff test as far as how many points you can put in any given sprint.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that prioritization we get from the strategy of the overall epics and the overall major features we want, we can then sort of rank them through the estimation processes. So t-shirt sizing is one you mentioned, and you can kind of break that down like rough guidelines of like, one sprint, a couple sprints, maybe 3, then 4 to 12, whatever the definition is, but you can kind of get an idea for doing that. Boy, I really like that one. That doesn't break my brain. T-shirt sizes, extra small, medium. I'm more of a medium. Large. I know another one you mentioned was like Fibonacci, which sounds really complicated, but there's like, a reason behind that where you have like 1, 2, 3, but then it goes like 5, 8, 13, and 21. And I've seen that at a lot of places. And it's even built into like most of the tools. And the reason you do that is you can kind of like spread out that gap a little bit. I don't know if you have any other reasons, but like instead of it being, oh, this is a 3 or a 4, those are like so close together. And because you're just kind of estimating this based on, your past experience and everything, like whether it's 3 or 4 is like really hard to argue since it's not super tightly evidence-based. But if you like can tell the difference between a 5 and an 8, there's like enough of a gap there where you can have a little nuanced conversation about it.
The general idea of pointing is to note difficulty, where the lower number speaks to its ease. Some places I've seen that could be as little as a chore that you do. The highest number could speak to an unknown. In fact, that tends to be a general rule of thumb. If I don't have enough information to point this, it is the highest it could possibly be. It's also a sniff test if something is the highest point that it could possibly be, that it probably should be better defined and possibly broken up into smaller tasks if possible.
Story points. So like kind of even taking a step back. So those are units of measure for estimating effort and complexity of all these tasks. So they are not hours. You will see them misused as hours or converted over to hours because you have your PMO style thinking before in waterfall, where that's really going to give the stakeholders comfort and this precision of it will be exactly this number of hours. And that's rarely the case. And it's kind of misused in doing that. But having that kind of rough guideline of whether you think it's going to be, 1 sprint, 2 sprints, or like you said, if it's like something so huge, like it's like, oh, this will probably be a few months or whatever, we need to break that down into smaller stories so we can like figure out what are all the interdependencies around that and figure out what is making it so long and be able to manage it a little more closely. Otherwise, it's a little bit easy to, have a few months go by and you're not shipping something where you can get feedback on it or figuring out whether it works or not and everything like that. But you will see story points misused quite a bit. But knowing that that's the case, trying to get the stakeholders a little bit of comfort that there is a relation to the timeline, but it's not as tightly as the hours that you see. Yeah, so one fun way to talk about estimating, I kind of mentioned briefly fun ways. So you can do those kind of Slackbot things. You could do sort of post-it note things with the Fibonacci, but there's a fun way to do it. There's even planningpoker.com and other apps where you are able to vote on these with those different numbers using whichever method you like Fibonacci or others. And as a team, it becomes kind of a fun exercise where you get consensus based on the different votes for how many story points you think it'll take. So I highly recommend doing that, especially in a way where that you don't see anyone's votes until they're compiled. So the best rule of crowdsourcing things, you go read like the wisdom of crowds and all that sort of thing. When they ask people questions and you don't see people's votes until the end, you usually get to a pretty accurate result instead of just like, the coolest person in the room or the most experienced or one with the coolest hats. You end up being able to get a pretty accurate result that way.
Nice hat, by the way. Coolest hat.
Absolutely. So we did mention velocity early on, not a velociraptor. Velocity is the average number of points that a team completes in a single sprint. And so when you're first starting out, you're trying to figure out what you estimate and then what you do. And then ideally, you're going to be getting better at completing more of those points per each sprint. But you will have a variation as well, and then teams change, and different parts of the product may be more complex or something like that, and you may or may not be good at estimating yet. So the average number of story points a team completes in sprints, and that helps us predict how much work we can handle in future sprints. so we can, bring in more resources and try to, create a faster velocity. But it's really just this view and a graph that's built into a lot of tools that helps us manage what we think we can get done in subsequent sprints.
Don't take it so seriously. It's something that's, if nothing else, a sniff test. You can make an inference, and as you noted, it's really based on the team size that you have at that moment. And the moment that you add or remove someone, that velocity is going to change. Don't be surprised. And that's your new normal. You can also think about if you have a heavy backend, a bunch of backend developers and you're doing a bunch of backend stories, wouldn't you know, your velocity is probably going to be a lot higher than when you do a bunch of front end stories. And that just speaks to the skill sets that you have on the team at that time. So be aware of that.
That's a good point, especially with anything metrics. And I'm a super analytics person, metrics driven, all over the place, but there's this over empiricization of metrics where we just look at a number and we're just like, it needs to be up. It's not up. Something's wrong. And I'm getting a little bit of PTSD from a project we were on where I heard the clients. So we're really every Monday kind of hammered on, did they get like 3 points done or 4 points done here? It's not that precise of a metric. It's not like you're on an Olympic bobsled and what you were like, we got 3.88 seconds instead of 3.9 seconds or whatever it is. That to me is like taking it too far. But to your point, like directionally, it's like, hey, the team got half done this week than we expected to, what happened? And maybe it's for whatever reason that resource was available or whatever it is. Like, it's a good discussion starter, but it feels like you could kind of shift into a place where you're kind of driving the team too hard on too much of a precision for a metric that doesn't actually offer that level of objectiveness that it pretends to.
Right.
Is that kind of what you're getting at?
100%. And it's important to know that the nature of pointing, it's an imperfect system. It's something that it's groupthink based on, known skills, right? I see a story and I have my own bias on how long I think that's going to take and how difficult it is, and I'm going to point that. Meanwhile, somebody else might have a different take on that, and that's going to affect the points. So in that way, points are sort of arbitrary, but as mentioned, a good sniff test.
Yeah, definitely. So velocity is between the sprints, so the points you're completing in each of them. Sprint Burndown is within that sprint. So let's say normally we have like 2-week sprints. I know people that are crazy do one. People on the other side do maybe 4 weeks or I guess more. But generally I see 2, maybe 3-week sprints. And within that sprint, there's a Burndown chart. So it's kind of those points over the number of days the sprint. So you have like day 1, you have all of them, and then the line goes down to 0. So it's just this linear progression that it thinks will happen. Of course, like these are different numbered points of stories, and they take different number of days, and you have different developers that are picking them up on different days. So it's really only helpful, I think, when you're looking near the end of the sprint and you're like, oh, whoa, we're like way down. Like, are we about ready to finish those last 3 stories? So that's like pretty much the only question I would use it for, which I've definitely had before. I'm like, oh, wow, we've got 3 stories that are at risk of not finishing. Let's check in on those and see if we need to, help them out, or maybe roll them to the next sprints and be ready to work on them next week.
It's good for a good guesstimate about your cadence. At the end of the day, all of these things are about having transparency in communication, both internally with the team and with your client, or if it's internal, your whomever, your product owner perhaps, and making sure that we're all on the same page, that, when we're doing stories and we have an assumption about how long it takes to do something, we're all checking ourselves on that. So just being honest and transparent at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, before we wrap, really, I think even taking a step back to what we were talking about before, I really recommend like taking some of these models for prioritization and then like literally asking even ChatGPT or Bard to do this for you if you can't think of them immediately. Or like take the Kano model and say like, I'd love to see a list of prioritized features for TikTok. So you can really like practice concretizing these like seemingly like nebulous concepts, and then that you can immediately like see what it would suggest. Now, I wouldn't suggest running your business that way because one, some of that data is a little bit out of date. Bard's a little bit more up to date, but it kind of gives you a basic idea of like, oh, like, these are the basic needs like on security and login or whatever. And then there's performance. Then you have those things kind of like you were talking about, like these exciters and delighters that like even though it may be hard, it could be a huge differentiating factor and something we really want to prioritize. And then where do we put, do we put a little bug that's a small thing like later on, or is it something that's really affecting the user experience and we need to prioritize a lot sooner? Even if it's something that's boring and seemingly like a little bit of a bug, it might be really, really important. So highly recommend applying these things and looking at it instead of just studying like the concepts and ideas. Really makes it come alive and makes it mean something and really help kind of cement that in your mind. So, Sam, any parting thoughts besides the ones you just gave?
Be excellent to one another. No.
Yes, I love that one. Extra credit for if anyone gets that's wrong. But all right, thanks, Sam. See you next week.